You're listening to What Goes On Here, and I'm Sam Walker. Whoever we are and whatever we do, we all have moments when we feel like we don't quite fit with the world around us. What Goes On Here is where you can listen to real stories of people who at times couldn't see a way forward, people who found themselves stuck, maybe in a life they never imagined would be theirs, people who had to face their fears, face themselves, but they changed, and changed lives of people around them too. This is Season 3, and Episode 3, Arno. In the divided and often polarised world that we live in, Arno Michaelis is a writer and speaker who travels all over the world talking to thousands of people about unity, acceptance and understanding.
I want to make the world a more peaceful place and cultivate our ability to love one another and care for each other.
But Arno used to preach hate. He was a reverend in a white supremacy movement based in Milwaukee in the Midwest of the USA.
I would have told anyone I met that the white race was facing a genocide and that if we white people didn't do something about it, we were going to be wiped off the face of the earth.
And he didn't just preach hate. He physically attacked countless people simply because of the colour of their skin or their sexuality.
So when I say that I remember numerous times where we beat people to a bloody mess and left them for dead, I can't say it was 5 times or 10 times or 3 times. Like, I don't know how many times that happened.
But then he wanted to stop. When your whole life is centred around an organisation you no longer want to be part of, how do you break free? And how do you forgive yourself for the horrendous violence and hatred that you've displayed in the past?
I spent over a year, every waking moment of every single day, I hated myself as viciously and as violently as I ever hated anyone else.
If I'd met you in your early 20s, what would you have told me about yourself and about the way you viewed the world?
When I was in my early 20s, I would have told anyone I met that the white race was facing a genocide at the hands of a Jewish conspiracy that had been going on for 2,000 years, and that if we white people didn't do something about it, we were going to be wiped off the face of the earth.
And what would you have said if I'd asked you why? Why are you a white supremacist?
I would have said that it was very plain and that I was aware of knowledge and situations that most people weren't. That idea of like being privy to some kind of secret knowledge is a real common thread in any kind of violent extremism. And it was definitely something that I would have considered myself plugged into back when I was 20 years old.
Here's a question I never thought I would ask someone. What first attracted you to the white supremacy movement?
When I got involved in the white supremacy movement, I was 16 years old. I was already a full-blown alcoholic. I had been drinking since I was 14. And from a very early age, I had been violent. I had been a bully on the school bus. I had gotten fights in the schoolyard. As a teenager, I felt like I hated the town I lived in. I hated my school, hated the government, hated the police. And by hearing white power skinhead music, it gave me kind of a context for this hate and violence that I was already familiar with. And that's what I found really attractive. My entire life, I kind of had this obsession with war and with the idea of being a warrior. As a very little kid, I used to read books about Greek myths and Norse myths and always kind of see myself in the role of these heroes that were going on quests and whatnot. And when I was in middle school, I played Dungeons and Dragons, which I still think is awesome. And I never want to make it sound like Dungeons and Dragons is a bad thing. But when I played D&D, I was the warrior. You know, I was going on this quest. I was like Conan and Beowulf all rolled up into one. And so here I was as a 16-year-old, very familiar with hate and violence, and now I hear this music that tells me, indeed, I am a warrior for my people, and there really is this huge fight going on and that I need to get involved to save my people from this horrible fate that awaited us if we failed.
What did your family say about what you were getting involved in?
My family was mortified. Both my mother and my father were really opposed to what I was getting into. Neither one of them approved of that ideology. They were very concerned about what was going to happen to me being out on the streets, cultivating hate and violence. I had a lot of friends from school, from high school, even going back to elementary school, some of whom were Jewish, some of whom were black, and they really just kind of faded out of my life. And talking to some of them now, reconnecting with them, they would tell me how worried they were about me, and it's touching to me to see that they were worried rather than offended. They weren't like, oh, why is he doing that to us? They were feeling like, what's going to happen to him? And they were more concerned about me than they were about my newfound hatred for them.
So what did being involved in this organization actually entail?
Yeah, we would go out on the streets and just pick fights with whoever we could find. At times, that would be a black kid that we found by himself or somebody that we thought was gay. Most often, though, we actually got in fights with other white kids, and it was really because they seemed to be the easiest targets. We would have never admitted this back then, but in the States, we have more guns than people. And that was the case back in the late 80s. And we knew that if we went into the inner city, like into the real ghetto areas, we were likely to get shot if we went there causing problems. And so we didn't do that. We would go to the more posh parts of town, pick fights with like frat boys and whoever else we could find that we felt would get a proper fist fight from, rather than going into areas that we knew were dangerous.
So when you were screaming at someone, when you were verbally abusing them, making their life hell, what about you? How did you feel?
At the time you do it, it's a rush. It's especially if you're actually you're in a fight that's challenging. Like if you're fighting someone who is big enough and tough enough to fight you back, it was like getting hit was it was like a hit of a drug. It was something that would give me an adrenaline rush and make me feel more alive than I ever did. When we were attacking people who were relatively defenseless to us, often like 10-on-1, it was, you still felt this kind of thrill of violence, but at the same time, even as I was doing it, sometimes I knew what we were doing was horrible, and I didn't have the courage to face that knowledge or to answer that inner voice, and I was really driven to try to suppress it constantly with alcohol and more violence and white power skinhead music, and surrounded myself by other pissed off white kids. But no matter how hard I tried, I could never truly rid myself of that self-knowledge that what I was doing was really wrong.
How many people did you hurt?
There were numerous times that I can remember. It's important to understand that I was rip-roaring drunk like throughout this 7-year period of my life, and that it's also important to understand that's absolutely no excuse. I'm not mentioning that to try to excuse my behavior, but I'm mentioning it because quite often I was blacked out drunk. So when I say that I remember numerous times where we beat people to a bloody mess and left them for dead, I can't say it was 5 times or 10 times or 3 times. Like, I don't know how many times that happened because of the alcohol.
How does it feel now talking about something so horrendous and knowing that it was you who did it?
It sucks. It's every time I face my past, it humiliates me. It makes me feel that I don't deserve success, that I don't deserve happiness, that I deserve to suffer. there's a lot of guilt and a lot of regret, and I wish there was a way I could take it back, and I wish there was a way I could help the people that I hurt heal. But I've never been put in contact with anyone that was a victim of mine, so I haven't been able to make amends personally in that regard. So I try to make the world a better place in my work today and really put all my energy into that. Being aware that if I am beating myself up and if I don't forgive myself and if I don't have compassion for myself, it diminishes my effectiveness in doing so.
So you went out into the world preaching hate and violence. What did the world give back?
Well, looking back on who I was then and kind of the mechanics of what I was putting out into the world and how the world responded, and especially kind of corroborating that with the work I do today, it really verifies to me that our environment, the society we live in, is absolutely a system, and that system produces output according to what kind of input you give it. So back in those days when I was literally radiating hate and violence to the world around me everywhere I went, the world reflected it, and it came back to me often in multiples. My best friend went to prison for shooting a kid that did a drive-by in our house within 6 months of starting the gang. Within 2 years, another very close friend of mine was shot and killed in a street fight. And of course, we would spin all these things that really happened because of our actions. We would spin them to justify our actions. So when my friend was shot and killed in a street fight, when he was literally out looking for trouble, we spun that to say, a white man can't even walk down the street without being murdered by these savages, and to make it sound like it justified our actions when in reality our actions are what brought that about.
Did you have some sort of manifesto? Was there a goal in mind?
Yeah, we always kind of talked about a goal or an intention, and that it did kind of evolve as my involvement in the group progressed over the 7-year period. When we first started it in 1987, we were absolutely just like drunken hooligans, and we were looking for an excuse to go beat people up, and that's what it was about. But as we got more involved with other established white power groups and started reading literature from them, we kind of got a more crystallized view of what we were trying to accomplish, and that kind of ended up being what we called a whiter and brighter world. And in the same way that the Hitler's National Socialist Party would have all this propaganda of these happy blonde-haired, blue-eyed families prancing through meadows and how wonderful everything was going to be when they achieved victory. We had the same sort of lies in our head regarding where we were ultimately going to be. And we made it sound very noble and romantic, like we're doing this for our white children so they can have a future, and for our white women so that they can walk the streets without being raped by savages, and it really like spinning it in that same propaganda technique to make our violence seem noble and seem necessary.
Was there no part of you at any time, Arno, saying, this is crazy, this is wrong?
I think, that inner voice was always there. It's the times when I wasn't drunk and was away from my guys were far and few between. But when those moments did happen, they were very uncomfortable. And that's why I tried to avoid them at all costs. I never wanted to be sober. I never wanted to be away from my guys or away from the white power music. Those are all kind of a lifeblood to me to fend off that inner voice that let me know what I was doing was wrong.
Where did this hatred come from?
Looking back, it came from my own suffering and from my inability to process that suffering in a healthy way. I was what everybody called a gifted kid. When I was a little kid, everybody said how wonderful I was and how I could accomplish anything I wanted to, but I lived in an alcoholic household, and my parents fought quite a bit, and my mom was always miserable, and that made me miserable. And I went out, and instead of being a good kid and saying, hey, how can I help, Mom? I love you, I just started to distance myself from her and from my dad and from a slew of teachers who were always trying to help me out. And as people told me how wonderful I was determined to prove them wrong and show them how horrible I was. And really to the point of like, you don't believe how bad I can hurt people. Like, buckle up, watch this. I'm going to show you how bad I can hurt people. I'm going to show you how bad I can make things for the status quo. And I really just felt the need to lash out and a need to repulse people. And of course, that didn't make things any better. And the more I did it, the more it made me suffer. And I get caught in this kind of vicious cycle of violence and suffering and violence and suffering. And that's where the hate stems from. And I believe that's true of any human being anywhere who ever feels hatred. The hate doesn't happen when you're happy and well-adjusted. It happens when you're hurting. And it's the lack of awareness of that process that really helps hatred thrive.
Do you know what I find quite frightening is that you are a really intelligent man. You're eloquent, you're clearly educated, and yet you were a vile racist. And I suppose I've always tried to explain away racism and bigotry by presuming people who live to that code are stupid, are uneducated. You're clearly not.
It is a very important thing to understand. There were other guys and girls in my group back then that were absolutely brilliant, that were incredibly intelligent people. And I think, and yes, there was a good share of the knuckle-dragging, dim-witted types that you would expect, but it's to me, it shows that this isn't about intelligence, it's about suffering. And being intelligent doesn't make you any more or less susceptible to suffering. And as a matter of fact, sometimes that intelligence can actually like help you perform the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual gymnastics that you need to in order to convince yourself of this ongoing state of terror. And the intelligence actually can become a liability more so than an asset. And I think that's definitely what happened to me back then. I do often point out I wasn't any less intelligent back then than I am now, even though I was doing really, really stupid things. So doing stupid things isn't necessarily an indication of stupidity. It's an indication of suffering again.
So I'm guessing the anger didn't disappear overnight, but where did it go?
The simple answer is exhaustion, and the more elaborate answer would be to talk about where that exhaustion came from. So as I was talking about before, like how I knew what I was doing was wrong, I had to expend a lot of energy in this ongoing attempt to suppress that knowledge, which was never successful. Once a human being experiences something, it's just impossible to remove that experience from who we are. And therefore, my ongoing efforts to suppress knowledge of my own hypocrisy and of what I was doing was wrong was incredibly exhausting. It was also exhausting to have to cut myself off from the outside world entirely and limit the intake of information, of culture, of media only to that which affirmed my violent white supremacist ideology. So I couldn't watch my favorite movies anymore. I couldn't watch TV anymore. I couldn't listen to music that I once liked. I couldn't be into sports that I once liked. In the States here, we're into the admittedly inappropriately named football. And we, as the foot rarely touches the ball, but in Wisconsin we have the Green Bay Packers, which is, I mean, it's like a cult here in Wisconsin. We get as crazy about it as anyone would for Manchester United or what have you. And I had to like sneak away to watch Packer games because I couldn't have it known to my buddies that here I am rooting for a bunch of black guys and white guys on the same team, and deriving joy from it. And as stupid as that sounds, that's what life was like as a white supremacist. I've always loved film. I've always loved music. Growing up, one of my favorite movies of all time, which it still is, was Blade Runner with Harrison Ford. And I remember one night, me and a bunch of skinhead buddies were going to a gas station to rent a movie. And I was like, oh, you guys got to see Blade Runner. It's an awesome movie. And as soon as we pop it in, the guys I'm watching it with are going, Harrison Ford's a Jew. He changed his name. This movie's Jewish. Everything about the movie's Jewish. And I was like, I'm pissed. And I'm like, will you just shut up and watch the movie? It's an awesome movie. But you can't do that when you're a white supremacist, because every little thing has to be seen through the lens of your ideology. And that stuff happened all the time. So it was exhausting to know I was a hypocrite and to know that I enjoyed things that were forbidden to me by my ideology. What was most exhausting of all, though, was when people who I claimed to hate treated me with kindness. And I was very fortunate that happened time and time again during my 7-year involvement in hate groups. And every time it did, I fled like a cockroach when the light was turned on. It was the most devastating response I could get from someone, and it completely destroyed everything I was trying to do when a black person or a Jewish person or a gay person treated me with kindness when I least deserved it. And all of this exhaustion built up to the point where I was literally looking for an excuse to leave. And that excuse came in kind of a two-part form. My girlfriend and I had split up. We had willfully conceived my daughter. And so when we split up in 94, I found myself the single parent to an 18-month-old. And a couple weeks after that, a second friend of mine was shot and killed in a street fight. And by that time, I had lost count of how many of my friends had been incarcerated. So it hit me that if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. And that was the excuse that I was looking for to leave. So I started walking away at that point. And it did take me a while to kind of find a new group of friends to hang out with and find a new way in life. But it didn't take too long, because within a year, I found myself going to rave parties on the south side of Chicago and really just like immersed myself into that counterculture, being a man of extremes. I went from being an extremely violent and hateful white racist to being a blissful, ecstasied out raver whose mantra went from one of racial holy war to one of peace, love, unity, and respect. And as I was shaking my ass to house music on the south side of Chicago at 4 a.m. on a Sunday in a filthy warehouse, surrounded by thousands of people of every possible ethnicity and gender identity and sexual orientation, I felt completely free. And I felt like it was just amazing to live in this world that wasn't driven by fear all the time and driven by hatred, and that all these different people could get together and not only not fight, but love each other and care for each other. And the people that I met in the rave scene accepted me and forgave me and embraced me unconditionally. Even when back then I still had swastikas tattooed all over my body. I'm still very close friends with tons of people I met in my rave days today.
Did becoming a father play a part in this as well?
Yeah, it absolutely did. I was going to a local community college during the week, and my daughter was in daycare there. She was about 4 or 5. And I remember one day I got there early, and I kind of hung outside the room that the kids were in, and I was just watching through a window. And I noticed how my daughter was playing with all these kids her age, some of whom were white, some were Asian, some were Latino, some were black, and they were all just children, and they were playing together, and they didn't really care about skin color or ethnicity. They just cared about whether someone was nice to them or not, and whether they had someone to play with. And that really struck me, and I was kind of just letting that sink in when a black man who was about my age came in to pick up his daughter, and she ran to his arms and jumped up and hugged him and said, "Daddy," just the same way that my daughter did with me. And I saw as he held his daughter, the love between them was no more, no less than the love between me and my daughter. And it was inspirational and devastating at the same time, because it reminded me how happy I was to be out of that time of my life, but it also reminded me that I had beaten up people so bad that only their parents could recognize them. And I felt, how would I feel if someone did that to my daughter? Or how would I feel if my daughter did that to someone else? And it really devastated me, and it was an ongoing issue that really, I mean, I'll always be working out in one way or another, but as happy as I was in the rave scene, it was something that would always come roaring back, especially as I would make friends with people that I would have attacked only a few years earlier. I had one friend who was this tiny, very flamboyant gay black man that I got to know and just felt was a wonderful person, and he knew about my past, and he didn't bother him. He didn't look at me as any less because of who I was, and that meant the world to me. But at the same time, I would remind myself that had I found him in a dark alley 3 years earlier, I would have beat him to death with my bare hands and then laughed about it and bragged about it to my friends. And that knowledge would always be there to come roaring back at me. It came to a head in 2007, actually, after I had quit drinking. In 2004, things got a bit more difficult as I didn't have the alcohol to numb my guilt and regret constantly. And in 2006, I met this woman who I was absolutely head over heels for. And in 2007, she dumped me, and I had this horrible heartbreak, and I started looking at myself saying, who do you think you are, thinking that you're going to go riding off in the sunset with some beautiful woman who loves you after you have hurt so many people, and after all this damage you've done to the world? How do you imagine that you deserve to have love in your life and happiness? And that's when all this stuff kept roaring back, and I found myself in a suicidal depression that lasted almost a year. It was my daughter who led me out of that, and because she needed help. She was having a hard time in school. She was being bullied, and she literally said to me, like, snap out of this. I need you. And that's what got me to start writing, because I felt like it dawned on me finally that I needed to reconcile my past before I could get on with my life and before I could ever be happy. And so that's when I started writing, and that's what ultimately became My Life After Hate, which was published in 2010.
At what stage when you meet somebody new do you say, by the way, I used to be a white supremacist? How does that come up?
It's interesting that non-white people tend to take it better than white people do. That's been my experience, and honestly, it comes up instantly, because when people ask what I do, like, that's what I do. I talk about my past, and I help people. I hope people can learn from it, and I want to make the world a more peaceful place and cultivate our ability to love one another and care for each other. And the reason why I do that is because of who I was. So I've had this discussion at customs numerous times, actually coming in and out of the UK. The border agent would be like, "Oh, and why are you in the UK?" And, "Oh, well, I'm a speaker, and I have a speaking engagement." "Oh, what do you speak about?" "I speak about violent extremism." And why is that? "Because I used to be a violent extremist." And it always comes up, and I'm very comfortable navigating it. I've always been a very open book. And nowadays when I do what I do, a lot of times people will be like, oh, you're so brave for going up on stage in front of 1,000 people and talking about what an idiot you were. And I just say it's way easier for me to do that than to not do it. Like the idea of keeping all this to myself is terrifying, and it almost killed me back in 2007. So my openness is very therapeutic.
You've talked a lot about how acts of kindness from the very people that you purported to hate were instrumental in changing you. And there was one specific woman who worked in your local burger joint who had a huge impact on you.
On payday, I'd go to McDonald's, I'd get a Big Mac, and when I walked in there for the first time, I was kind of struck by this elderly black woman who was there working behind the counter, in that she had this beautiful smile on her face. And this smile was just so genuine and so kind, and it shone on everyone who walked through the door into that McDonald's in the same way that the sun shines on everyone. It doesn't matter what color your skin is or how much money you have or whether you're a white power skinhead or a gang member, the sun shines equally on everyone. And that's how this woman's smile was. And I noticed it right away, and it made me very uncomfortable because I was trying to hate black people, and her smile made it very difficult for me to hate her. So I walked up and I ordered my food, and she was very pleasant, and I was very uncomfortable, and I got out of there. A week goes by, it's payday again, and I'm at the same McDonald's, and there she is again, and she remembers me this time, and she's asking me about my day, and she's talking about the weather, and she remembered what I ordered, and she's just super nice, and again, this is just really making my skin crawl because it's indicating to me that everything I'm trying to do and everything I think I am is completely wrong. So I get my Big Mac and I scurry out of there again, and a week goes by and I'm drinking and fighting. And Saturday night we had a big raging party going on, as we did every night, and somebody came by with a homemade tattoo machine, and I thought it would be very clever to get a swastika tattooed on my middle finger. Specifically got the swastika on my middle finger so that when people would reflect my hostility and say, you know what, you're a racist, you don't like black people, you don't like gay people, whatever, and they would come at me reflecting my anger, I would show them the swastika on my middle finger, and I would say, yeah, what are you going to do about it? So the tattoo was expressly designed to repulse people and to infuriate people. And I certainly wasn't thinking of the sweet elderly black woman who worked at McDonald's when I got the tattoo. And it didn't hit me until the following Wednesday when I walked into McDonald's again and I saw her behind the counter, that I was just like, oh my God, I don't want her to see this tattoo. And I sat there in the doorway for a minute, and I was thinking about where the next closest McDonald's was, which was not close, and it was winter and it was freezing, and I was on foot. And for a minute, I was thinking, like, doesn't anybody else work here? Like, it's always her. And I sat there for like 5 minutes hoping somebody else would come up to the counter, but no one did. And so finally I said, well, I'll just keep my hand in my pocket and she won't see it. And I go up there and not thinking that I have to reach in my pocket to get my money out. And when I did so, she noticed it, and she looked me in the eye and she just said, I know that's not who you are. You're a better person than that. And I just said, can I just have my Big Mac, please? And I got my food, and I left it, and I was absolutely flustered. I went home and I got as drunk as I could, as fast as I could, and I went out on the streets and I picked a fight with the first person I could find, because I had to put as much distance between where I was and this singularity of kindness that I had experienced because of this woman's courage and because of her steadfast humanity that refused to sink to my level and refused to be diminished by my inhumanity. And as hard as I tried to forget that incident, it never went away. And it was certainly a contributing factor in this exhaustion that led me to want to leave the movement. And in that sense, this woman's courage and her act of kindness and forgiveness helped to change the course of my life. I don't think it's a stretch to say that without that woman, I would probably be dead or in prison right now. And I'm very fortunate that nowadays I've done over 200 speaking engagements. I've worked face-to-face with over 20,000 people, many of whom are young people who could be considered at risk. And if one of those kids makes a better decision in their lives because of hearing my story, now that woman's act of kindness has changed 2 lives, and therefore changed all the lives in their presence and everyone that they know. So this is a grave that a mother won't be crying over. This is a prison cell that won't be occupied. And this is how a simple act of kindness can literally change the world. And so that's a big part of my message nowadays, is for people to never underestimate the power of an act of kindness, not only to change someone else's life, but to cultivate our own happiness, which can lead to our own success. And that's how important kindness is in the human experience.
You turned your back on violent extremism. There is still so much of it in our world. How do we fix it?
My answer to all the problems we face as a society is to practice kindness, gratitude, and forgiveness. Because when people are happy, they are not going to be hateful, and they're not going to be violent. And this is, a lot of people think this is naive. They think it's some kumbaya, roasted marshmallows around a campfire kind of thing. And that's certainly true, it is, but it's also tactical, because we're addressing the root that hate and violence stems from. And unless you address the root causes of hate and violence, you can change policy and butt heads on political issues all day long, and you're not going to do anything but make it worse. It means cultivating kindness and compassion and forgiveness and gratitude, and it absolutely means doing that, especially with people who support those destructive elements in our society. We need to show them that there is nothing to fear. That their fear is unfounded, and that all as human beings have far more in common than we have different. And kindness, compassion, forgiveness, and gratitude are ways to demonstrate that. It doesn't matter what color our skin is, what country we're from, what language we speak, who we're attracted to, how much money we got or don't got. Everybody understands simple, genuine kindness. Everybody understands simple, genuine gratitude and forgiveness. So when we practice these things, we're communicating with the people who need to experience these things in their lives that there is a better way to live and a better way to look at the world.
We've all done things that we're ashamed of, big or small, and it can be really hard to move on from doing something that you feel ashamed of. Have you forgiven yourself?
If we forgive ourselves for mistakes that we made, it doesn't dishonor the people we may have offended. It actually honors them. And it makes us, it puts us in a position to truly atone for those mistakes. In that sense, I am going through a process of self-forgiveness, and it's an ongoing process, like everything else in life. I'm never going to reach a point where I'll be like, hey, I'm forgiven. Glad that's over with. But I have reached a point where there is less and less time where I sit and hate myself for who I used to be. There was a time in my life where I spent over a year doing that every waking moment of every single day. I hated myself as viciously and as violently as I ever hated anyone else. Today, I still run into spells where I feel like that, but they last for hours or at the most for a day rather than for years. And whenever they arise, I remind myself that this is repercussions of what I've done. But because I've had so many amazing people in my life who have been there for me, who have loved me and forgiven me and accepted me unconditionally and demonstrated for me a better way to live my life and a way that I can help other people. I'm more familiar with that world now than I am with the world of hating myself. And that's why self-hatred is an anomaly now rather than the norm. And my norm is really a daily practice of gratitude. It's a practice of kindness and a practice of forgiveness. And I do these things not only because they help other people, but because they're building blocks of my own happiness. And that's where I just keep bringing myself back to.
Arno Michaelis was talking to me, Sam Walker. Arno's excellent book is called My Life After Hate. You've been listening to What Goes On Here. Coming up next on Season 3, Episode 4, Abigail.
Even there was one time I'd, gone into school and I'd had like a black eye where my mum had hit me, and my teacher had said, what's happened? Is everything okay? And I just said, oh, my little brother threw a toy car at me, and I just made up a lie on the spot because, again, I had this loyalty to my parents that no matter what wrong they were doing to me, I didn't want them to be in trouble in any way.